Marcus Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse suite, his reflection ghosting against the glittering cityscape of Manhattan below. At 45, he had everything most people spent their lives chasing: a billion-dollar tech empire, a collection of luxury cars that would make collectors weep, and a wife whose beauty turned heads at every charity gala and board meeting. Yet as he swirled the aged whiskey in his crystal tumbler, a hollow ache gnawed at his chest. "Sir, Mrs. Bennett's car just left the building." Elena's voice crackled through the intercom. His executive assistant's tone carried an undercurrent of concern she couldn't quite mask. "Thank you, Elena. Any word on her destination?" A pause. "The art gallery in Chelsea, according to her calendar." Marcus's jaw tightened. The same gallery where Sarah had been spending an increasing amount of time over the past 3 months. His wife's renewed passion for art should have delighted him. It was what she'd given up to support his dreams 15 years ago. Instead, each late night, opening and weekend exhibition filled him with a creeping dread. He pulled out his phone, opening the tracking app he'd installed last week in a moment of weakness. The blue dot representing Sarah's phone moved steadily downtown, but then his stomach clenched, veered west toward the meatpacking district, nowhere near Chelsea. Another lie, he muttered, draining his glass. The changes had been subtle at first: new clothes, a different perfume, lunch meetings that ran suspiciously long. Then came the whispered phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room, the password changes on her devices, and the defensive flare in her eyes whenever he questioned her schedule. Marcus moved to his home office, unlocking the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. Inside lay a manila envelope containing weeks of surveillance photos: Sarah entering hotels, Sarah laughing over intimate dinners with a man whose face was frustratingly obscured in every shot, Sarah emerging from a jewelry store clutching a small bag on a day she'd claimed to be at a spa. His fingers trembled as he spread the photos across his desk. The woman in these images was a stranger wearing his wife's face. The Sarah he'd fallen in love with, the passionate art teacher who'd believed in him when he was nothing but a dreamer with a startup would never. But people change. Money changes them. He'd seen it countless times in his rise to the top. Perhaps he'd been naive to think their love would be different. Marcus picked up his phone again, pulling up a contact he'd been wrestling with calling for days. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Dr. Chen? It's Marcus. I need your help with something unconventional. Something that will show me once and for all where Sarah's heart truly lies." As he outlined his plan, a part of him screamed that this was madness. But the larger part, the part wounded by each small betrayal, knew there was no turning back. Sometimes the only way to find the truth was to orchestrate a lie that would force it into the light. "You understand what you're asking?" Dr. Chen's voice was heavy with concern. "The ethical implications." "But I understand everything." Marcus cut him off, "including the fact that I'm the only one who stands to lose anything if I'm wrong." But he wasn't wrong. He couldn't be. And soon he would have proof one way or the other. 15 years earlier, Marcus wasn't the titan of industry whose name graced magazine covers and tech blogs. He was just another dreamer in a cramped studio apartment in Brooklyn, surviving on ramen and coffee while coding until dawn. The startup that would become Bennett Technologies was nothing more than a string of ideas scrawled across a whiteboard and a handful of maxed-out credit cards. That was when he met Sarah. She taught art at a struggling public school in the Bronx, her classroom a riot of color and creativity that stood in stark contrast to the gray concrete outside. Marcus had been there to pitch a pilot program for teaching coding to underprivileged kids, more of a PR move than anything else, trying to build buzz for his fledgling company. "You're in the wrong classroom," she'd said, not looking up from the student portfolios she was reviewing. Paint smudged her cheek, and her dark hair was twisted into a messy bun secured by 2 paintbrushes. "Actually, I think I'm exactly where I need to be," he'd replied, and that was the beginning of everything. Sarah saw past his rehearsed pitch to the passion underneath. Over coffee that turned into dinner, she'd challenged his ideas, refined his vision. Technology without creativity is just mechanics, she'd argued. But combine them, that's how you change lives. They were married within a year, Sarah trading her classroom for a tiny desk in their apartment's corner, where she designed the user interface that would make Bennett Technologies' educational software revolutionary. Her artist's eye made complex coding concepts accessible to children, while her teacher's heart ensured no student was left behind. Success didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it was explosive. The company's IPO made headlines, and suddenly the couple who once shared $2 slices of pizza were dining at Michelin-starred restaurants. Their Brooklyn walk-up became a Manhattan penthouse, and Sarah's paint-stained sweaters gave way to designer dresses. You should have seen her at first. Elena Rodriguez, Marcus's executive assistant of 12 years, often told new employees. She'd show up to black tie events with charcoal smudges on her hands from sketching new designs. But she had this authenticity that made even the stuffiest board members smile. Elena had watched Sarah's gradual transformation from passionate artist to polished socialite. The charity galas, the country club memberships, the endless rounds of lunches with other executives' wives, it was all part of the role she was expected to play. "Sometimes I miss the old Sarah," Elena admitted during a rare, vulnerable moment. She used to bring her sketchbook to the office and draw portraits of the staff during lunch breaks. Dr. James Chen had been there through it all, from treating Marcus's stress-induced migraines during the startup days to becoming the family's trusted physician and friend. Success changes people, he'd warned Marcus during a checkup last year. Not always for the worse, but it changes them nonetheless. The key is changing together. But Marcus had been too busy building an empire to notice the growing distance. Board meetings replaced dinner dates. International expansions meant missed anniversaries. The couple that once stayed up all night brainstorming ideas now communicated primarily through calendar invites and quick texts, which was why Michael Torres's reappearance in Sarah's life had set off such alarm bells. Her childhood friend from art school days had resurfaced at a gallery opening 3 months ago, and suddenly Sarah's passion for art was reignited. She began attending exhibitions again, her eyes sparkling with that old enthusiasm as she discussed contemporary artists and emerging techniques. "Michael just gets it," she'd gushed after one such evening. "He remembers who I was before all this." She'd gestured vaguely at their surroundings, and Marcus had felt a chill at the hint of wistfulness in her voice. What Marcus couldn't know was that Elena watched these developments with growing concern, logging Sarah's increasingly frequent absences in a discreet file. That Dr. Chen kept his own counsel about the ethics of what he was about to be drawn into. That Michael Torres had motives of his own, far more complex than anyone suspected. And Sarah? Sarah carried secrets that would shake the foundations of everything Marcus thought he knew about trust, love, and the true cost of success. Dr. James Chen paced his private office at Mount Sinai Hospital, his footsteps echoing against the sterile walls. "Marcus, what you're proposing isn't just unethical, it's potentially illegal. We're talking about falsifying medical records, lying to hospital staff." "You won't have to falsify anything," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I've researched this. There are medications that can safely simulate a coma-like state. All you need to do is monitor me and ensure nothing goes wrong." The plan had taken shape over sleepless nights and paranoid days. Marcus had arranged everything: a business trip to Dubai scheduled for next week, a carefully orchestrated car accident on the way to the airport, and most crucially, Dr. Chen's involvement to sell the medical authenticity of his condition, and the other hospital staff. "They'll be told it's a severe reaction to the trauma. You're the attending physician, your word carries weight." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense. "James, you've known Sarah and me since the beginning. Haven't you noticed the changes? The secrets? I need to know the truth." Dr. Chen sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "And if the truth isn't what you expect, what then?" Marcus didn't answer. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. Marcus's private car, driven by a trusted security team member, supposedly hydroplaned on the FDR drive. The actual impact was carefully controlled, but the 911 calls and emergency response were very real. Elena made the call to Sarah, her practiced professional composure cracking just enough to convey urgency without panic. "Mrs. Bennett, there's been an accident. Mr. Bennett is being taken to Mount Sinai." Sarah arrived at the hospital in record time, her designer heels clicking frantically against the linoleum floors. Her face was bare of makeup, hair hastily pulled back, wearing what appeared to be one of Marcus's old Columbia sweatshirts. She burst into the emergency department, wild-eyed and desperate. "Where is he? Where's my husband?" From his carefully positioned bed, Marcus could hear everything through the partially open door. The medication Dr. Chen had administered made him appear unconscious while maintaining full awareness, a cruel irony that matched his mission. Dr. Chen met Sarah in the hallway, his expression grave. "Mrs. Bennett, please sit down. Your husband suffered severe trauma in the accident. While his physical injuries are relatively minor, he's experiencing an unusual neurological response. He's in what we call a trauma-induced coma." Sarah's knees buckled. A nurse rushed forward with a chair, but Sarah was already pushing past them both into Marcus's room. The sob that tore from her throat was raw, primal, something Marcus had never heard from his normally composed wife. "Oh God," Marcus, her fingers trembled as they traced his face, careful to avoid the artfully placed monitors and IV lines. "Baby, please wake up. We were supposed to have dinner tonight, remember? I have something important to tell you." Marcus fought every instinct to respond, to comfort her. Her tears felt like acid on his skin. But then her phone buzzed. Once. Twice. 3 times. Sarah withdrew to the hallway, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I can't talk right now." "No, you don't understand. Marcus, there's been an accident, of course, this changes things." A long pause. "The documents will have to wait. I need time to think." "Documents?" Marcus's heart rate increased enough that a nurse glanced at the monitors. Dr. Chen smoothly adjusted something in his IV line, maintaining the charade. The next few days established a pattern. Sarah spent hours at Marcus's bedside, alternating between tearful reminiscences and long stretches of tense silence. She brought his favorite books, played their wedding playlist softly on her phone, and sometimes just held his hand, her wedding ring cool against his skin. But there were other moments. Hushed phone calls in the hallway, furtive meetings with Michael Torres in the hospital cafeteria that Elena quietly documented. And most troublingly, Sarah's late-night visits to Marcus's home office, photographed by the security cameras he monitored remotely on his tablet during the quiet hospital nights. "She's searching for something specific," Elena reported during one of her daily hospital visits, ostensibly to bring flowers and check on her boss's condition. The office, the study, even the safe in the wine cellar. What could be so important that it couldn't wait until he recovered? What documents had she mentioned in that phone call? On day 5, Sarah arrived looking particularly exhausted, dark circles prominent under her eyes. She sat beside Marcus's bed for a long time in silence before finally speaking. "I know you probably can't hear me," she whispered, "but I need to confess something. I've been keeping secrets from you, Marcus. Big ones. And now I don't know if I'll ever get the chance to explain." Marcus's pulse quickened again, but this time it had nothing to do with the medication. "I found things," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "Things that change everything. I wish you'd trusted me enough to tell me the truth yourself." Before Marcus could process her cryptic words, a nurse entered to check his vitals, and Sarah retreated back into silence. But her words echoed in his mind, mixing with his own suspicions until he could no longer be certain who was truly deceiving whom. The plan was working, but it was revealing far more questions than answers. The first week of Marcus's self-imposed coma stretched like an eternity. Each beep of the heart monitor marked another moment of forced stillness, another fragment of truth revealed through his vigil of artificial sleep. Sarah maintained a religious routine, arriving each morning with fresh flowers and coffee for the nurses. "They're taking such good care of you," she'd whisper to Marcus, smoothing his hair back from his forehead with tender familiarity. But beneath her devotion, subtle changes emerged like hairline cracks in a precious vase. Nancy, the night shift nurse, noticed it first. Mrs. Bennett was on her phone until 3 a.m. last night, she mentioned to Dr. Chen during rounds. Pacing the hallway, arguing with someone in whispers. When I brought her tea, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Marcus absorbed every detail through his veil of manufactured unconsciousness. The medication Dr. Chen administered kept him appearing comatose while maintaining his awareness, a cruelty he was beginning to regret as the weight of Sarah's distress became unbearable. On day 8, Michael Torres made his first appearance. Marcus recognized his voice from charity events, smooth, cultured, with an undercurrent of intensity that had always set his teeth on edge. "Sarah, we're running out of time," Michael's urgent whisper carried from the hallway. "The board meeting is in 3 days." I know. But I can't just... He's lying here, Michael. My husband is lying here, and Your husband kept this from you for years. He didn't trust you with the truth. Remember that. The truth about what? Marcus wanted to scream, to rip out the IV and demand answers. Instead, he lay motionless, his mind racing beneath the facade of medical sedation. Elena's daily reports grew more concerning. Mrs. Bennett accessed the company's servers last night, she murmured while adjusting Marcus's pillows for show. She downloaded files from the restricted executive drive. And Michael Torres, he's been asking questions about the Singapore merger. A Singapore merger. Marcus's heart rate spiked enough that Dr. Chen had to adjust his medication. That deal was supposed to be completely confidential, the cornerstone of Bennett Technologies' Asian expansion. How did Michael even know about it? Sarah's behavior shifted as the days wore on. Her morning visits grew shorter, more perfunctory. The tender touches were replaced by distracted phone checks. Sometimes she'd sit in silence for hours, her expression hardening into something Marcus had never seen before, determination mixed with what looked unsettlingly like disappointment. "I found the offshore accounts," she told his supposedly unconscious form on day 10. "Did you think I wouldn't? That I wouldn't understand what they meant?" Her laugh was bitter, nothing like the warm sound he remembered from their early days. "I taught myself to read financial statements, Marcus. Learned corporate law. While you thought I was just playing society wife, I was preparing. Because deep down I knew something wasn't right." Marcus's guilt warred with his suspicion. Yes, there were offshore accounts, necessary evils in the tech industry, his CFO had assured him. But how had Sarah found them? And more importantly, why had she been looking? The hospital staff watched the drama unfold with professional discretion tinged with soap opera fascination. They noted how Mrs. Bennett's designer outfits gave way to practical pantsuits, how her tearful vigils transformed into intense meetings with stern-faced men in expensive suits. "She reminds me of someone preparing for battle," observed Dr. Chen during one of his checks, his voice heavy with meaning. "Marcus, whatever game you're playing, I'm not sure you're the only one with cards held close." The hallway outside Marcus's room became a stage for whispered scenes he was never meant to witness. Sarah and Michael, heads bent over documents. Sarah arguing in fierce undertones with someone who sounded suspiciously like Bennett Technologies' lead counsel. Sarah on endless phone calls in multiple languages. Since when did she speak Mandarin? His executive assistant added another layer of complexity. "Someone's been accessing your private email archive," Elena reported. "The attempts are sophisticated. They'd have succeeded if I hadn't upgraded the security protocols last month." She hesitated. Mrs. Bennett's credentials were used, but the access points traced back to Michael Torres's art gallery. The guilt of his deception began to crush Marcus with the weight of the medical equipment surrounding him. He'd orchestrated this elaborate ruse to test Sarah's loyalty, but each passing day suggested he was the one being tested. Every revelation spawned new questions, every answer unlocked new mysteries. On day 12, he overheard Sarah on the phone, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "We have enough evidence now. When Marcus wakes up, he'll have to face what he's done. I just never believed he could." Her voice broke, and for the first time since this began, Marcus heard genuine tears. Not the theatrical grief of a guilty conscience, but the deep, wounded sobs of true heartbreak. What had he done? What evidence? The questions pounded in his head like the steady rhythm of his heart monitor, each beat bringing him closer to a truth he was no longer sure he wanted to face. The truth exploded on day 13 of Marcus's fake coma, shattering his carefully constructed deception like glass. Sarah burst into his hospital room well past midnight, clutching a leather portfolio. Michael Torres followed, but this time he carried something that made Marcus's blood run cold, a press badge from the Wall Street Journal. "I can't believe I'm doing this here," Sarah said, sinking into the bedside chair. "But he deserves to know first, even if he can't hear me." She reached for Marcus's hand, her touch gentle despite everything. "I'm so sorry, my love, but I had to protect you, protect everything we built together." Michael stepped forward, digital recorder in hand. "Mrs. Bennett, for the record, when did you first suspect financial irregularities at Bennett Technologies?" Marcus's heart monitor jumped erratically. Dr. Chen, doing a late check, quickly adjusted his medication while shooting him a warning look. 3 months ago, Sarah's voice was steady now. I noticed discrepancies in the charitable foundation's accounts, donations that didn't match our records. Then I found transfers to accounts in Singapore that didn't align with any legitimate business operations. She pulled documents from her portfolio papers Marcus recognized from his private safe. That's when I contacted Michael. Not because I was having an affair, but because his reputation as an investigative journalist specializing in corporate fraud was exactly what I needed. The pieces fell into devastatingly clear focus. The gallery meetings, the whispered phone calls, Sarah's sudden interest in company finances. We discovered that someone inside Bennett Technologies was using the Singapore merger as cover for massive fraud. Michael explained, his recorder capturing every word. But shell companies, falsified contracts, millions in misappropriated funds, all structured to implicate Marcus Bennett if it ever came to light. Sarah's voice broke. Your CFO, Marcus. Richard was setting you up to take the fall. He knew you trusted him completely, never questioned his financial strategies. The offshore accounts, the mysterious investors, it was all groundwork for his exit plan. Marcus felt the room spinning despite his horizontal position. Richard, his CFO of 10 years, his friend from business school. The Singapore merger had been his idea from the start. Mrs. Bennett's cooperation was crucial, Michael continued. She provided access to key documents, helped us trace the money flow. Her background in art actually proved invaluable. She recognized irregularities in the foundation's art acquisition prices that broke the whole case open. Sarah leaned closer to Marcus's still form, her tears falling on his cheek. I couldn't tell you. Richard monitored your communications, your meetings. We needed everything to appear normal while we gathered evidence. Then your accident happened and she drew a shaky breath. Maybe it was for the best. He got sloppy while you were here, thought he could accelerate his plans. The story breaks tomorrow, Michael said quietly. Richard's been arrested an hour ago. The SEC has frozen the suspicious accounts. Bennett Technologies' legitimate assets and operations are protected. But Marcus lay there, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his mistake. While he'd been plotting to expose his wife's supposed infidelity, she'd been working desperately to save him from destruction. Every suspicious meeting, every secretive phone call, every late night at the gallery, all of it had been to protect him, their company, their shared legacy. I just hope, Sarah's voice wavered. I hope when he wakes up, he can forgive me for going behind his back. That he'll understand why I had to keep him in the dark. The irony was almost unbearable. Marcus had never felt more unworthy of forgiveness in his life. But Dr. Chen, who had been silent throughout the revelations, finally spoke. Mrs. Bennett, I think there's something you need to know about your husband's condition. Before Dr. Chen could finish his confession about Marcus's condition, Marcus opened his eyes. The moment of revelation couldn't wait any longer. The weight of truth and deception had become too heavy to bear. I heard everything, he said hoarsely, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah's scream pierced the midnight quiet of the hospital room. She stumbled backward, knocking over her chair, her face draining of color. Michael Torres instinctively moved to catch her, his recorder clattering to the floor. That's impossible, Sarah whispered. You were in a coma, the doctor said. Dr. Chen stepped forward, his professional demeanor cracking under the strain. Mrs. Bennett, your husband was never in a coma. The medication, the monitoring, it was all staged. He wanted to test your loyalty. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's expression transformed from shock to comprehension to something worse, a deep, wounded betrayal that made Marcus wish he really had been unconscious all this time. Test my loyalty, her voice trembled. While I was fighting to save everything you've built. While I was trying to protect you from being framed for federal crimes, she pressed her hands to her mouth, a horrible laugh escaping. Do you have any idea what these past 3 months have been like? Discovering the fraud, realizing someone you trusted was stealing millions, having to pretend everything was normal while gathering evidence. Sarah, Marcus tried to sit up, fighting against the lingering effects of the medication. But no, she held up her hand. You don't get to speak right now. You lay there for 13 days, listening to me pour my heart out, watching me fall apart, and said nothing. Do you know what that makes you? Michael cleared his throat. I should go. The story. The story can wait 5 minutes, Sarah snapped, her composure cracking completely. My husband just revealed he's been gaslighting me while I was trying to save his company. I think the Wall Street Journal can give me a moment to process that. Marcus reached for her hand, but she stepped away. I saw the surveillance photos in your desk, he admitted. The hotel meetings, the secret phone calls, I thought. You thought I was having an affair. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Those hotel meetings? I was gathering testimony from whistleblowers who were too scared to come forward officially. The phone calls? Coordinating with federal investigators. Every single thing you misinterpreted, every action you twisted into evidence of betrayal, was me fighting for you. The monitors around Marcus's bed began beeping as his heart rate increased. Dr. Chen moved to adjust them, but Marcus waved him away. He deserved this pain. The press is waiting in the lobby, Michael said quietly. This story's about to break wide open the fraud, the arrests. We need to decide how to handle, he gestured between Marcus and Sarah, this complication. Outside the room, footsteps and voices signaled the arrival of more reporters. The story of Richard's arrest was already spreading, and soon the vultures would descend. Sarah Marcus's voice broke. I was so wrong, so terribly wrong. I let fear and suspicion poison everything. Please. Please, what? Sarah turned to him, tears streaming down her face. Please forgive you for not trusting me, for lying to me, for making me think I might lose you while I was already fighting to save you from destruction. She shook her head. You know what the worst part is? I still love you. God help me, I still love you. But I don't know if I can ever trust you again. The door burst open as reporters and photographers flooded the room, cameras flashing, questions overlapping in a cacophony of chaos. In the midst of the media storm, Marcus watched helplessly as Sarah straightened her spine, wiped her tears, and transformed into the polished, professional woman he'd forgotten she'd learned to become. The story would break tomorrow, but the real damage was already done. In trying to test his wife's loyalty, Marcus had proven himself the traitor to their love. 3 months after the scandal broke, Marcus and Sarah sat in their marriage counselor's office, the space between them on the couch both physical and emotional. The headlines had finally begun to fade. Bennett Technologies CFO sentenced, CEO's wife saves company corporate fraud scheme thwarted by art teacher turned whistleblower. I've stopped checking our stock price every hour, Marcus said quietly. Elena says we're stabilizing. The board's confidence is returning. Sarah nodded, twisting her wedding ring, a gesture she hadn't lost despite everything. The foundation's art program is expanding. We're using my experience to teach financial literacy through creative expression, helping others spot the warning signs I almost missed. The corporate fallout had been manageable, thanks to Sarah's meticulous evidence gathering. Bennett Technologies had emerged wounded but healing, its reputation salvaged by the story of corruption discovered and defeated from within. But the personal damage that was proving harder to repair. I've moved all our accounts into both our names, Marcus continued, following their therapist's advice about practical steps toward transparency. You have full access to everything now, and he swallowed hard. I deleted the tracking app from my phone. Sarah's eyes met his for the first time that session. I've stopped taking calls in other rooms, she offered, even when it's just Elena updating me on the new compliance procedures. They were small steps, each one an exercise in rebuilding trust. The weekly dinner dates where they talked about everything except work. The joint interviews where they faced the press together, shoulder to shoulder. The long nights spent reviewing company documents, not because Sarah needed to investigate anymore, but because Marcus wanted her insight, her artist's eye for detail, her teacher's gift for explaining complexity. I miss who we were, Marcus admitted one evening, standing at their penthouse windows. Before the money, before my suspicion, before I forgot that you were always the strongest part of us. Sarah joined him, close but not touching. We can't go back to who we were, she said softly. But maybe we can build something better. Something built on truth this time. Complete truth. The transformation of their relationship was gradual, like a painting revealed one careful brush stroke at a time. Sarah's art studio returned to their home, set up right next to Marcus's home office, doors open between them. Marcus learned to ask instead of assume, to voice his fears instead of plotting to confirm them. Sarah learned that strength didn't mean shouldering burdens alone. Their love story hadn't ended, it had evolved, shaped by crisis into something more resilient, more honest, more real. They were no longer the dreaming entrepreneur and the passionate art teacher. nor the power couple playing roles of CEO and socialite. They had become something else, partners in the truest sense, their trust rebuilt on a foundation of hard-won wisdom and conscious choice to believe in each other again. 1 year after the events that shook their world, Marcus and Sarah Bennett stood together at the opening of the Bennett Foundation's newest initiative, the Trust, Transparency in Business Arts program. The walls of the converted warehouse space showcased student artwork exploring themes of corporate ethics, while executives from major companies mingled with aspiring artists and business students. Sometimes the greatest tests of love aren't the ones we plan. Sarah addressed the crowd, her hand firmly clasped in Marcus's. They're the ones that force us to choose between fear and faith, between suspicion and trust. We learned that the hard way. Marcus stepped forward, his humility evident in his stance. My wife taught me that true loyalty isn't about tests or surveillance. It's about believing in someone enough to let them prove you right. The program they created together had already helped uncover 2 major corporate fraud cases, with Sarah's unique combination of artistic insight and financial acumen becoming a model for a new kind of corporate oversight. They weren't perfect. Trust was still a daily choice, a conscious effort to believe in their best selves rather than their worst fears. But they were real, and that made their love story more powerful than any fairy tale.